The heavy oak doors of the private banquet hall didn't just open, they groaned under the weight of a desperation that ignored the laws of the underworld. Outside, the Seoul skyline was a blurred smear of neon and charcoal, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the stifling silence of absolute power. Shin Hyunwoo sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his dark suit as sharp and unforgiving as his reputation. He was in the middle of a sentence, a calculated directive regarding the port territories, when the world tilted. The intrusion was a physical shock. A woman, small and trembling, stumbled past the bewildered guards whose hands hovered over concealed holsters. Lee Miare didn't look like a threat, she looked like a tragedy. Her deep green dress was saturated, clinging to her frame like a second skin, and her hair was a chaotic web of wet strands plastered to her pale, terrified face. She didn't stop until she reached the head of the table. To the assembly of syndicate leaders, she was a ghost, a servant who had forgotten her place. But to Miare, the room was empty of everyone but the man with the clenched jaw. With a jagged sob that cut through the low hum of the air conditioner, she fell. Her knees hit the polished floor with a sickening thud, and then she did the unthinkable. Her small, pale hands reached out, her fingers locking onto the sleeve of Hyunwoo's jacket. The fabric was a rare wool-silk blend, costing more than Miare earned in a year, and now it was being ruined by the grime and rainwater of the Seoul gutters. A collective intake of breath hissed through the room. Touching the boss without permission was more than a breach of etiquette, it was a death sentence. Hyunwoo froze. He felt the damp heat of her palms through the fabric, a startling contrast to the icy detachment he usually maintained. He looked down at the woman kneeling before him, her brows tense and bracing for a blow that didn't come. She was leaning forward urgently, her lips parted in a silent, agonizing plea. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of a world he had long ago abandoned, a world of raw, unfiltered love and the bone-deep terror of losing it. "Please," she finally gasped, her voice a fragile thread in the oppressive silence. "Please save my daughter. They took her, boss. They took my Soyeon." The guards moved in then, their shadows falling over her, but Hyunwoo didn't give the signal to remove her. He remained grounded, his posture protective even as his mind calculated the cost of this moment. The entire city would hear of this, that a maid had brought the Iron King of Seoul to a standstill with nothing but a wet dress and a mother's prayer. For the first time in a decade, the silence in the room wasn't born of fear, but of a stunning, breathless anticipation. The heavy oak doors of the private banquet hall didn't just open, they groaned under the weight of a desperation that ignored the laws of the underworld. Outside, the Seoul skyline was a blurred smear of neon and charcoal, but inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive tobacco and the stifling silence of absolute power. Shin Hyunwoo sat at the head of the long obsidian table, his dark suit as sharp and unforgiving as his reputation. He was in the middle of a sentence, a calculated directive regarding the port territories, when the world tilted. The intrusion was a physical shock. A woman, small and trembling, stumbled past the bewildered guards whose hands hovered over concealed holsters. Lee Miare didn't look like a threat, she looked like a tragedy. Her deep green dress was saturated, clinging to her frame like a second skin, and her hair was a chaotic web of wet strands plastered to her pale, terrified face. She didn't stop until she reached the head of the table. To the assembly of syndicate leaders, she was a ghost, a servant who had forgotten her place. But to Miare, the room was empty of everyone but the man with the clenched jaw. With a jagged sob that cut through the low hum of the air conditioner, she fell. Her knees hit the polished floor with a sickening thud, and then she did the unthinkable. Her small, pale hands reached out, her fingers locking onto the sleeve of Hyunwoo's jacket. The fabric was a rare wool-silk blend, costing more than Miare earned in a year, and now it was being ruined by the grime and rainwater of the Seoul gutters. A collective intake of breath hissed through the room. Touching the boss without permission was more than a breach of etiquette, it was a death sentence. Hyunwoo froze. He felt the damp heat of her palms through the fabric, a startling contrast to the icy detachment he usually maintained. He looked down at the woman kneeling before him, her brows tense and bracing for a blow that didn't come. She was leaning forward urgently, her lips parted in a silent, agonizing plea. In her eyes, he saw a reflection of a world he had long ago abandoned, a world of raw, unfiltered love and the bone-deep terror of losing it. "Please," she finally gasped, her voice a fragile thread in the oppressive silence. "Please save my daughter. They took her, boss. They took my So-yeon." The guards moved in then, their shadows falling over her, but Hyunwoo didn't give the signal to remove her. He remained grounded, his posture protective even as his mind calculated the cost of this moment. The entire city would hear of this, that a maid had brought the Iron King of Seoul to a standstill with nothing but a wet dress and a mother's prayer. For the first time in a decade, the silence in the room wasn't born of fear, but of a stunning, breathless anticipation. The silence that followed Lee Miare's plea was not merely quiet, it was a pressurized vacuum that seemed to suck the oxygen from the opulent hall. Across the obsidian table, the syndicate leaders, men who controlled the flow of billions and the lives of thousands, sat like statues carved from ice. They had seen men executed for less than the smudge of mud she had just left on Shin Hyunwoo's sleeve. In their world, a breach of protocol was a breach of power, and power was the only currency that kept them alive. Every eye was fixed on Hyunwoo's hand. They expected a sharp recoil, a barked order to the security detail, or perhaps the slow, deliberate reaching for the handgun tucked inside his waistband. Instead, they saw something that felt like a glitch in the fabric of their reality. Hyunwoo's fingers, thick and calloused from decades of struggle, did not push her away. They twitched, then settled, hovering near the woman's trembling shoulder as if he were trying to remember how to offer comfort. The guards, who had surged forward with a practiced, lethal efficiency, stopped mid-stride. Their leader, a scarred man named Park who had served the Shin family for 20 years, looked at his boss with a confusion that bordered on panic. The unspoken rules were the bedrock of their organization, they were the armor that protected the king. By allowing this woman to remain, Hyunwoo wasn't just breaking a rule, he was dissolving the very aura of untouchability that kept rival gangs at bay. Whispers of disbelief rippled through the subordinate ranks at the back of the room. One of the younger bosses from the southern district shifted in his chair, his eyes darting toward the exits, sensing a shift in the wind. The Iron King was supposed to be a machine of logic and cold steel. Yet, as Hyunwoo looked down at the sobbing mother, the mask of the predator seemed to slip, revealing a man who looked suddenly, dangerously human. The city of Seoul functioned on the belief that Shin Hyunwoo had no heart. But as he remained anchored in his seat, ignoring the ruined fabric of his suit and the shocked stares of his peers, that belief began to crumble. The silence stretched until it was unbearable, a deafening roar of anticipation. The syndicate leaders realized they weren't just witnessing a maid's desperation, they were witnessing the birth of a new and unpredictable kind of power, one that chose protection over pride. Finally, Hyunwoo spoke, and his voice was a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate the very glass in their hands. "Leave us," he commanded, his gaze never leaving Miare's face. "All of you. Now." The heavy, double-leafed doors clicked shut behind the last of the retreating syndicate leaders, leaving the hall in a silence so profound it felt like the weight of the ocean. Shin Hyunwoo remained motionless, his hand still resting inches from Miare's trembling frame. The only sound was the rhythmic dripping of rainwater from her dress onto the pristine floor. "Speak," Hyunwoo said, the single word carrying the weight of a command and a promise. Miare's voice came out in a jagged whisper, raw and stripped of any dignity. She explained that it had started with a shadow in the servants' entrance, men who didn't belong in this neighborhood. They had cornered her 2 nights ago, showing her photographs of her 7-year-old daughter, So-yeon, playing in the park. They knew the girl's school, her favorite flavor of ice cream, and the exact time Miare tucked her in at night. "They said I owed them," she sobbed, her forehead nearly touching the toes of his polished shoes. "My brother, he disappeared months ago. They claim he took a loan from the Red Serpent Circle. $67,000. Hyunwoo's eyes narrowed. The Red Serpents were a mid-level pack of scavengers, bottom feeders who thrived on the interest of the desperate. To a man of his stature, $67,000 was the cost of a dinner or a piece of art. To a maid like Miare, It was an astronomical sum that represented 1,000 years of labor. They didn't want the money from me, she continued, her breath hitching. They knew where I worked. They told me that if I didn't give them the security codes to your private study, if I didn't leave the back service gate unbolted tonight, they would send me So-Yun's fingers, one by one. Her hands tightened on his sleeve, her knuckles white. She had spent 48 hours in a living hell, caught between her loyalty to the man who gave her a livelihood and the life of the only person she loved. In the end, there had been no choice. But when she tried to follow their instructions, her conscience had shattered. She couldn't betray the boss, but she couldn't bury her child. I didn't give them the codes, she wailed, the terror finally breaking her. I couldn't do it. So they took her from the school gates this afternoon. They sent me a message saying she's at the industrial docks. They're going to kill her, boss. Because I didn't open your door, they're going to close hers forever. Hyunwoo felt a cold, familiar rage beginning to simmer beneath his skin. It wasn't just the breach of his estate's security that angered him, it was the realization that these vultures were using a mother's love as a skeleton key. He looked at the ruined fabric of his sleeve, then at the broken woman at his feet. The red serpents thought they were playing a game of leverage. They didn't realize they had just stepped into the path of a hurricane. Hyunwoo reached into the inner pocket of his coat, producing a pristine silk handkerchief. He didn't use it to wipe the mud from his sleeve, instead, he handed it to Miare, his movements slow and deliberate. As she took it with trembling fingers, a small, crumpled piece of paper fell from her damp palm and fluttered onto the dark wood of the table. He picked it up. It was a Polaroid photograph, the edges curled and softened by the humidity of the rainy night. In the image, a young girl sat on a park bench, her light-colored top stained with splashes of mud and her patterned skirt rumpled. This was Shin So-Yun. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated confusion, her wide eyes searching for a mother who wasn't there. Her cheeks were flushed, not from play, but from the heat of fear, and her skin looked damp as if she had been caught in the same downpour currently lashing against the manor's windows. For 30 years, Hyunwoo had maintained his empire by viewing people as chess pieces or obstacles. He had survived by extinguishing the part of himself that felt the weight of another person's pain. But as he stared at the girl in the photo, something shifted deep within the tectonic plates of his soul. The carefully constructed walls he had built after his own childhood losses, walls made of ice and calculated violence, didn't just leak, they began to crack. He saw the way the child was being supported by the rough hand of an unseen captor just off camera, a grip that was meant to steady her for the photo but succeeded only in highlighting her fragility. She looked so small against the backdrop of a city that devoured the weak. A strange, phantom ache settled in Hyunwoo's chest, a dormant paternal instinct that had no business existing in a man of his profession. He looked from the photo to the woman kneeling at his feet. Miare was watching him, her breath held, her entire existence suspended on the edge of his reaction. In that moment, he wasn't looking at a maid who had breached security, he was looking at a mother whose world had been stolen. The icy detachment that was his greatest weapon felt suddenly like a heavy, useless shroud. She has your eyes, Hyunwoo murmured, his voice losing its serrated edge for the first time in memory. He stood up, the chair scraping against the floor like a thunderclap in the silent hall. He didn't call for the cleaners to fix his suit. He didn't call for the lawyers to discuss the debt. Instead, he tucked the photo into his breast pocket, right over his heart. The Iron King was gone, replaced by something far more dangerous, a man who finally had something to protect. Stand up, Miare, he said, his jaw tightening into a line of lethal intent. We are going to bring her home. Hyunwoo didn't wait for Miare to process his words. He turned back toward the obsidian table, where the echoes of his earlier command to leave still hung in the air. A few of the senior syndicate members had lingered near the doorway, their faces masks of disbelief, waiting for the Iron King to snap back into his usual, frozen orbit. Instead, they watched him reach for his phone and dial a number that was reserved only for emergencies of the highest order. Cancel everything, Hyunwoo said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. The shipment at the docks, the meeting with the Japanese delegates, the acquisition of the northern sector. All of it. Clear the calendar until further notice. A sharp intake of breath came from the doorway. To cancel the summit was a declaration of instability, to abandon the delegates was an invitation to war. Millions of dollars were dissolving into the ether with every syllable he spoke. His chief of staff, a man who had seen Hyunwoo stay composed during police raids and assassination attempts, stepped forward, his face pale. "Sir, with all due respect, the delegates have been traveling for 18 hours. The fallout from this will be catastrophic for our reputation. The city will think we've lost our focus." Hyunwoo turned his head slowly, his gaze so predatory that the younger man instinctively recoiled. "Let them think I've lost my focus," he rumbled. "By tomorrow, they will realize I have finally found it." He didn't offer any further explanation. In the brutal logic of the Seoul underworld, a boss's time was his most guarded asset. By sacrificing the summit for a maid's daughter, Hyunwoo was committing the ultimate transgression against the syndicate's code. He was placing a single, insignificant life above the collective profit of the empire. He grabbed his overcoat, ignoring the damp patch on his sleeve where Miare had clung to him. He signaled to Park, his head of security. "I want the armored SUV. No sirens. No fanfare. Just me, you, and the girl's mother." "Boss," Park hesitated, "if the Red Serpents see you coming personally, they'll know they have leverage. It's better to send a tactical team." "No," Hyunwoo replied, stepping toward the door with a stride that forced everyone in the hall to scatter. "I want them to see me. I want them to understand exactly what happens when they touch something that belongs to my house." As he walked out into the torrential rain, the news began to ripple through the city's encrypted channels. The Iron King had walked out. The summit was dead. To the observers in the shadows, it looked like madness. But to Hyunwoo, as he climbed into the driver's seat and looked at the terrified mother beside him, it was the first time in 30 years that his path had been perfectly clear. The black SUV tore through the rain-lashed streets of Seoul, its tires carving through deep puddles that reflected the city's frantic neon pulse. Inside, the silence was jagged. Shin Hyunwoo sat in the back, his broad shoulders casting a shadow over Miare, who clutched the silk handkerchief like a lifeline. He wasn't looking at the city, he was looking at the dashboard screen, which was alive with flickering data points and rapidly moving cursors. For decades, the vast intelligence network of the Shin Syndicate had been used to track rival shipments, monitor police movements, and hunt down those who dared to betray the family. It was a machine built for destruction. But tonight, for the first time in its history, the machine was being recalibrated for a different purpose. "I want every street camera within a 5-mile radius of the girls' school scanned for Red Serpent plates," Hyunwoo commanded, his voice a low vibration that seemed to steady the air. "Now." On the other end of the encrypted line, technicians who were used to facilitating disappearances scrambled to perform a miracle. The resources of a multi-billion-dollar empire were being focused on a single child in a patterned skirt. Satellite imagery filtered through the storm, and deep web informants were squeezed for information not on drug routes, but on the location of a specific gray van seen near the school gates. "Boss," Park said from the front seat, his eyes glued to a tablet. "We've got a hit." A vehicle matching the description was spotted heading toward the industrial shipyard, Area 4. "It's a graveyard for old shipping containers. Perfect for a hideout." Hyunwoo didn't respond with words. He simply leaned forward and tapped the driver's shoulder. The vehicle surged, the engine's roar primal sound in the night. To the city watching from the windows of high-rise apartments, it was just another luxury car speeding through the dark. They had no idea that the most efficient killing machine in South Korea was currently being guided by the memory of a little girl's wide, confused eyes. As they neared the docks, the neon glitz of the Gangnam district faded, replaced by the rusted skeletons of cranes and the oppressive gloom of the industrial sector. Hyunwoo checked his weapon, but his focus remained on the phone in his hand, where the GPS coordinates of the kidnappers were being pinpointed with surgical precision. He looked at Miare. Her face was pale, her lips moving in a silent prayer. In his world, prayer was for the weak, but as he watched her, he realized that her desperation was the fuel for his resolve. He wasn't just hunting for a girl, he was hunting for the chance to prove that his power could finally be used to build something that wouldn't eventually crumble into ash. The hunt was no longer about the business of the city, it was about the soul of the man leading it. The industrial shipyard was a labyrinth of rusted iron and salt-cracked concrete, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of flickering security lights. Heavy rain hammered against the corrugated metal of the shipping containers, creating a rhythmic, deafening roar that masked the approach of the black SUV. When the vehicle finally skidded to a halt in front of Warehouse 14, Shin Hyunwoo didn't wait for his guards to clear the perimeter. He stepped out into the deluge, his dark overcoat billowing behind him like the wings of a predatory bird. Inside the warehouse, the air was cold and smelled of damp earth and diesel. A circle of men from the Red Serpent Syndicate stood beneath a single, buzzing halogen bulb. They were laughing, their voices echoing off the high rafters, until the heavy steel door was kicked open with such force that the hinges shrieked. Razor Rodriguez, a man whose face was a map of cheap tattoos and old scars, stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of a blade. "You're a long way from the manor, Boss Shin," he sneered, though his eyes betrayed a sudden, sharp flicker of panic. "We didn't think a maid's brat was worth the fuel for your car." Hyunwoo didn't speak. He scanned the room until his gaze landed on a small, huddled figure in the corner. So-yeon was tied to a wooden chair, her light-colored top now gray with grime, her eyes wide and overflowing with tears as she looked at the stranger who had interrupted her nightmare. Seeing the fragile innocence in person, caused the last of Hyunwoo's restraint to snap. "You have 3 seconds to move away from the child," Hyunwoo said, his voice a low, lethal rumble that carried more weight than a gunshot. "Or what?" Razor barked, signaling his men to draw their weapons. "You're outnumbered, Shin. This isn't your territory." "Everywhere the sun sets is my territory," Hyunwoo replied, stepping into the light. He didn't reach for his gun. He moved with the terrifying confidence of a man who knew he couldn't be stopped. When the first enforcer lunged, Hyunwoo intercepted him with a brutal, surgical strike to the throat, followed by a kick that sent the man crashing into a stack of crates. The room erupted into a blur of violence. Hyunwoo fought with a deadly intent that the Red Serpents had only heard of in hushed whispers. He wasn't just fighting to win, he was dismantling them for the audacity of their choice. He moved through the circle of men like a force of nature, his massive frame absorbing blows that would have felled a lesser man. Finally, he stood over a gasping Razor, his hand locked around the man's throat, lifting him until his toes barely grazed the concrete. "The debt is paid," Hyunwoo hissed, his jaw clenched in a mask of fury. "But the interest for her tears, that, you pay to me." He hurled the leader into the darkness and turned toward the chair, his entire demeanor softening as he reached for the girl. The roar of the violence died away, replaced by the ragged breathing of broken men and the steady, indifferent drumming of the rain against the warehouse roof. Shin Hyunwoo stood in the center of the debris, his chest heaving, his dark suit jacket torn at the shoulder. He didn't spare a second glance for the Red Serpents groveling in the shadows. His entire universe had narrowed down to the small, trembling figure tied to the chair. He approached So-yeon slowly, consciously retracting the lethal aura that had just leveled the room. He knelt in the dirt and oil, his knees hitting the cold concrete without a thought for his dignity. With a flick of a small, concealed blade, he sliced through the coarse ropes. The moment the restraints fell away, the little girl began to collapse, her legs too weak from terror to hold her weight. Hyunwoo reached out, his movements a startling blend of power and precision. He placed one firm hand on the child's arm to steady her, his grip grounded and protective. It was the same hand that had signed death warrants and crushed rivals, but now it was a silent anchor, absorbing her tremors. As she leaned forward, her damp skin pressing against his palm, he felt the frantic, bird-like beat of her heart slowing down, syncing with the steady rhythm of his own. "It's over," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant shield. "I have you. No one will ever touch you again." So-yeon looked up, her flushed face streaked with grime and tears. She saw the clenched jaw and the sharp facial features of the man her mother served, but she didn't see the Mafia boss the city feared. She saw a savior. With a small, broken sob, she pitched forward, burying her face into the damp fabric of his shoulder. Hyunwoo stiffened for a heartbeat, unaccustomed to the weight of such pure, unconditional trust, before his arm instinctively wrapped around her, pulling her small frame into the safety of his broad chest. He stood up, lifting her effortlessly, his posture straight and unyielding. He walked out of the warehouse and back into the rain, shielding her body with his own. Miare was already stumbling out of the SUV, her screams of So-yeon, piercing the night. As Hyunwoo handed the girl into her mother's frantic, weeping embrace, he felt a strange, cold void where the child's weight had been. He watched them, the mother in the wet green dress and the daughter in her stained skirt, clinging to each other in the neon-lit downpour. For 30 years, Hyunwoo had believed that power was something you used to take. But as he stood there, drenched and bleeding, watching the two people he had saved, he realized that power was actually something you used to keep the world from taking everything away. The Iron King was gone, in his place stood a man who finally understood what was truly worth ruling. 6 months had passed since the night the rain tried to wash away the sins of the industrial docks. In a quiet corner of a revitalized neighborhood in Seoul, the morning sun glinted off the freshly painted sign of a small, vibrant florist shop. Inside, the air was a sweet tapestry of lilies and jasmine, a far cry from the metallic scent of blood and diesel that had once defined Shin Hyunwoo's life. Lee Miare stood behind the counter, her green dress replaced by a practical apron, her face no longer a mask of terror but one of hard-won peace. She looked out the window and smiled as a sleek, black SUV pulled quietly to the curb. It was a Tuesday, and in this neighborhood, Tuesday didn't mean a Mafia summit, it meant a visit from the man the city still whispered about in hushed, reverent tones. Hyunwoo stepped out of the vehicle. He still wore the dark, expensive suits that signaled his status, but the clenched jaw and icy detachment had softened into a composed, watchful intensity. He didn't come with a fleet of armed guards, he came with a small, wrapped box and a single, rare orchid. As he entered the shop, the bell chimed, a sound that used to make Miare flinch, but now acted as a herald of safety. From the back of the store, a streak of light-colored fabric and laughter erupted as So-yeon ran toward him. She didn't see the Iron King or the predator who had dismantled a syndicate, she saw the man whose one firm hand had held her steady when her world was falling apart. She collided with his knees, and the most feared man in Seoul did something that would have stunned the entire city. He laughed, a low, genuine sound, and lifted her high into the air. The transformation was complete. Hyunwoo still ruled, but his empire was no longer built on the unspoken rules of fear. His protection was now a silent canopy over this shop and this family. He had learned that true power wasn't found in the number of men who bowed to him, but in the trust of a child who reached for his hand. As they sat together in the small garden behind the shop, drinking tea and looking over So-yeon's latest drawings, the violence of his past felt like a fading ghost. The city would always have its shadows, but here, under the watchful eyes of the silent guardian, the light prevailed. He had spent a lifetime building walls to keep the world out, only to find that the greatest strength lay in the courage to let two people in. The smallest hands had indeed carried the greatest power, proving once and for all that even the hardest heart can choose love over fear.